welcome to part 3 of our series on Danny Faulkner's book, Falling Flat. We're going to pick up on my notes in concerning page 41 in my digital version, or 40, depends on where it hits in your version. So he had been talking about a whole bunch of very fallacious things, but now he's aiming at Rowbotham and his demonstration at, to determine the very long canal that the Bedford level, that it proved that there was no curvature. And then Faulkner mentions someone named Alfred Russel Wallace, who took up a challenge as a result of this, and apparently he altered the technique a bit. He placed 2 identical objects at different locations along the Bedford level. He examined each object from a telescope on the bridge and found that the nearest object appeared higher than the more distant one. Let me just stop there and say, duh. You know instinctively, if you're standing on a street side and look at telephone poles, the one closest to you is the biggest. The one farthest away is the smallest. He doesn't really get very precise here in saying, what do you mean it's higher? Anyone who knows anything about perspective knows that in the case of the telephone poles, for example, they are taller and at the front than the back, and as each pole gets farther and farther away, the successive poles, we have to be more precise here, then we know also that everything goes to a convergence point in the center of your vision. So the bottoms of the poles appear to be rising, as does the ground that they're on, and the tops of the poles appear to be falling. We know they're all the same height, and normally very precise distances between them. And so it looks like they're getting smaller at top and bottom. They're getting, they're less high and they start higher up. So they get shorter and shorter. That's just perspective. That's how we see distance. And to say that this proves anything about what we're standing on is again begging the question, and it's a non sequitur, among other possible fallacies. But the point is that anything close to you is going to appear bigger. This is just so basic and elementary. I don't know why they think it proves anything. But this person, Wallace, did this little demonstration, and Faulkner says, why the difference? He says, first of all, he says that because the nearest one is higher, it's consistent with the results predicted by spherical Earth. Why do you think that is? Again, I think the footnote here in Faulkner's book points to Occam's razor for some reason, unless I clicked on the number, so it's digital, so it's not like I misread the number. But he says, why the difference? A temperature inversion is common over bodies of water during spring and summer, causes light initially traveling tangent to the Earth's surface to bend downward, resulting in light traveling around the Earth's curvature. This is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. He's moved the goalpost, first of all. Suddenly, conditions matter. He didn't talk about conditions before. And then he says light travels around and a tangent, and all these things are presupposing a ball in the first place. He's begging the question and ignoring any other possible explanations. And this temperature inversion, if you know anything about optics or the physics of light, you know that light only changes direction when it hits a change in density. And that's where it changes. It doesn't keep changing or arcing after that point. It only changes its trajectory, you might say, at the point of the difference in density. And it will bend, seemingly, as this is not the most precise term, but it will refract at the point of change and go toward the thickest part. It seems counterintuitive, but that's the physics of light. You can go online and prove it to yourself. There are many images of various kinds of lenses and prisms with light beams shining on them that prove this to be true. So this isn't even a question. This is demonstrable. That light bends toward the thickest part of a change in density. Now he's saying that light can go all the way around a giant ball this way. But there's only one way that's possible. And that's if you presume that on the surface of the Earth are multiple vertical columns of various densities that just happen to get thicker and thicker as they come toward you. Toward you it's the thickest and farther away is the thinnest, and that's just the only way light is going to quote unquote bend around a ball. If you have all of these changes of density and they get thicker and thicker. But I don't think anybody in their right mind would believe that this is the condition in nature. There are no vertical columns of densities that get thicker as they get toward you. You might intuitively think, well, as the farther I look, the thicker the air is because I'm looking through more of it, and that would be more accurate. But instead, it has to be backwards in order to bend light from something beyond the curve to make a mirage of sorts that bends toward you with all these columns of differences. So if you want to talk about temperature inversion, first of all, you have to prove that that's exactly the condition holding at this time that you're viewing, and that there is a sequence of different ever-increasing densities between you and the object getting denser toward you. So, and then to say the word tangentially, the only time you can have a tangent is if you have a circle or a ball. That's the question that was being debated here. So you can't presume it in your premises, or that's begging the question. But also called a tautology. But that's exactly what Faulkner is doing here. He's saying, I can imagine a scenario that never happens in nature that will bend light all the way around a giant ball, and that this explains away what diameter and circumference that we have decided that the Earth is. So I would ask at this point, well, if conditions can totally throw those numbers out the window, then what good is it to have a curvature calculator, an Earth curve calculator? What good is that, since the condition of no lensing at all never happens, and if it did happen, you couldn't have any of these temperature inversion mirages. So you can't presume a tangent, because that's begging the question, and you can't demonstrate light bending all the way around a ball unless you have these vertical columns of ever-increasing density. He says he'll discuss this more in the next chapter. That will be fun. But then he says something about new converts joining the movement. Treating flat Earth like a religion is what he's doing. And we could easily use the same criteria to call heliocentrism a religion. But it's the ball earthers who zealously defend their belief, even to the point of writing hit pieces and attending conferences. I don't do that to go to someone else's ball earth proof meeting. I don't even know if such things happen. They're the norm, so you don't need to have conferences, except now that they're afraid of flat Earth, they have to have them, I suppose. I don't know. If they did, I wouldn't go because I don't care. I already know the heliocentric model, and I know what they're arguing here in this book, if you can call it arguing. But the point is that it's pots and kettles again. He's trying to make every attribute of flat Earth teachings, I guess you could say, yet he himself is guilty of many of the same things, as we've already made note, especially between old Earth and young Earth. So he is, as I've said in a prior video, dropped all pretense of objectivity or professionalism or even Christian behavior. And then later on, this says page 40, an interesting case is Wilbur Bolivia in 1906. He had gained control of the Christian Catholic Church based in Zion, Illinois, and he amassed total power. This is smearing. There's nothing else to call it. And he power in the church, that is to say, and the city, and that he came to be a flat earther. Well, I don't think he would have said amassed power or anything like that if this person had convinced everyone Earth is a ball. So anyway, he goes on to smear the guy with a lavish lifestyle and dictatorial control. Gosh, that sounds like Calvin in Geneva. But anyway, this dissension, he says, in the Great Depression took its toll, and the church fell on hard times, and then Bolivia died in 42, and the church was gone, and a few members remained. What is all this for? What does it prove? It's anecdotal evidence of one case, of a small area, a small number of people. What is it proving? It almost sounds like when in the Bible, Gamaliel argued before the Sanhedrin that whenever a leader rose up to lead some kind of rebellion, the leader was killed in the rebellion. The people who were following him scattered and time again. And so he advised the Sanhedrin to let the disciples go. This is after Jesus arose and ascended, and said, the leader's been eliminated some way or another, and my advice to you is it'll scatter like any other rebellion if this is not from God. And if it is from God, you're not going to win against them. It sounds like this similar reasoning as far as what he may or may not be trying to make a point about. I can't do more than guess. But why give this evidence? It's almost to say, see, every time a group of people believe in flat Earth, it comes to nothing. That's all I can get out of that. And I'm not going to try anymore. So now he brings up the Flat Earth Society, which most flat earthers hold to be controlled opposition. If you don't know what that term is, look it up. But basically a fake flat Earth group because of some of the ridiculous things they say. And it is this group, which he knows the flat earthers that he's been hanging around with don't agree with. Their group has the flying disc in space with water falling off the edge, is my understanding. So if you want to smear your opponents as crackpots, all you have to do is associate them with the Flat Earth Society. And that's exactly what Faulkner is doing here. And then a little bit later, he says, it's interesting that the flat earthers of today have published few books on the subject, opting instead to promote flat earthers primarily with YouTube videos. Does this mean that when Answers in Genesis puts out a video, we shouldn't watch it because it's YouTube? They have books, they're PhDs. Of course, you have, publish or perish. If you're a PhD, I hope you have written some books. But I don't know what point he's trying to make here either, other than to just smear, because there's no reason why people should have written a lot of books about it. I mean, we're living in an age of electronic communication, and there are a lot of important things that people haven't written books about. Why this should be a reason to reject flat Earth? This is not an argument against flat Earth. This is not something that anyone with any sense of self-esteem would try to use against flat earthers to prove them wrong or to answer their tough questions that supposedly these poor Christians that Danny's writing to are unprepared for. How is this going to help them? Are they going to, does he think people are going to pull out this page in his book and go, hey, you guys haven't written any books like this one, and win an argument or convince anybody? And then he mentions a couple in his book, and then like, oh, okay, well, nobody has books. Well, okay, there's a couple, but see, there's only a couple. Isn't this the same kind of smear that old earthers have used against young earth creationists and saying you guys aren't real scientists? You're not properly peer reviewed, all sorts of things. It's the same thing. Danny is being like the wicked servant in the parable that Jesus told that I mentioned in an earlier video, where he expects to complain about the tactics used against him and young earthers of any kind and turn around and use them against flat earthers. Now he gets to a point he calls why I wrote this book. I think we already know. But he says it's ironic that more people in the West today may believe that the earth is flat than have in 2 millennia. Why is that ironic? What would make it ironic? In an age where information is not gate kept by the public schools anymore, which I'm sure annoys the powers that be. This is a double-edged sword. They can control a lot of people, but they also can't control everybody. And a lot of information gets out, even though it's shadow banned or banned outright, and people get arrested sometimes for their free thinking. But he says that this is just so ironic that people would believe in flat Earth. Well, maybe the better question is, why is it that when people can get around the gatekeepers finally, they believe the Earth is flat and don't believe heliocentrism? And then he says, let's see, I think I missed, there's a few notes that aren't showing on here that I have in the book. Maybe I didn't get into this copy, but he says he's interacted with a few flat earthers in person, via email, and on a few websites. It's been impossible to convince true believers, remember that term, in the flat earth, that the earth is a globe. They are very quick to dismiss all evidence to the contrary. We could again point that right back at young earth creationists, and Danny in particular, and say, you're very quick to dismiss things. And you haven't offered any real counter arguments so far. And don't hold your breath for any to come in the rest of the book. He is a true believer. He absolutely is convinced, and his career is based upon modern heliocentric theory, which has very much in common with ancient pagan things. And we'll get into that later, I think, in the book. But the point is that he's been in contact, so again, he has no excuses for the information he's misrepresenting about flat earthers today. But this character flaw he's trying to paint flat earthers with can be painted on him as well. Now let's see if we can catch up with our quotes here. And I have a note that says it's ironic that a Christian astronomer and young earth creationist can't see how he treats flat earth the way old earthers treat young earth creationism, as I just explained. What was that parable Jesus told in Matthew 18:21-25 about the unmerciful servants? So this is what I'm talking about in my notes when I mention this, because it's just got all the same characteristics of that situation. So he says professing Christian believers in the flat earth, he says it doesn't seem to faze in the least these professing Christians when I point out that this puts them in the position of accusing several Christian brothers of lying about one of the biggest things that happened in their lives. He talks about Freemasons and all sorts of things and conspiracy. But by calling people professing believers, he is questioning salvation, which is not his, it's above his pay grade, let's just say. So he's making all these rhetorical questions that can be thrown back in his face. But this thing of saying professing Christians is calling us unbelievers. Apparently he doesn't understand the gospel. That's all I can conclude from this, because the gospel, salvation, who is a real believer, a real Christian, depends on whether you have faith in the Jesus who rose from the dead, to reconcile you to God. That is the gospel as stated in the Bible. And yet he says, if you believe in flat earth, you must not be saved by calling us professing Christians. And I've made the remark many times over the years that just because people believe in inconsistent things doesn't mean they're not Christians. People can be mistaken. Everybody has some kind of blind spot somewhere that isn't consistent with the rest of their stated beliefs. And I believe that young earth creationists such as Faulkner have been wildly inconsistent with their stated beliefs on many occasions, as I've pointed out some in this book so far. But the point is that this is unbecoming of a professional, of a PhD, of a Christian, to question people's salvation over this issue. But this is his fear. Since he believes that you can't be a real Christian, is what he is implying here, and be a flat earther, That's why he's so afraid of flat earth, because he thinks that it means you're not saved. And it doesn't seem to matter if you express to him, as some of us have, that you believe in the Jesus who rose from the dead and you're trusting him to reconcile you to God. That doesn't matter if you're a flat earther, according to Danny, according to this statement that he's made about professing Christians. So he better be careful about what he says, but that's not something we can expect in this book. He says his own personal observations that dispute what flat earthers teach is met with great skepticism. There's a good reason for that. He asks people if he's lying. Well, again, if he's misrepresenting what we believe and we know he knows better, what other word should we use for that? And there's also confirmation bias that he cautioned his readers against, but he himself is suffering from, as far as we can tell from what he's writing here. And he says, maybe I'm just incompetent and I can't properly make and interpret such observations. Isn't that what he accuses flat earthers of doing? Why doesn't he like that accusation in return? Why doesn't he like the taste of his own medicine? Is he calling all of us liars, fake believers? Is he? And he says that question is usually left unanswered. No, that's not true. And then he says, I wish that flat earthers would apply even an ounce of such skepticism to the flat earth arguments they encounter on the internet. This happens all the time. People that came to these conclusions by asking questions and questioning not only heliocentrism, but some things that other flat earthers say that have been rigorously tested and argued, and he knows it. And people do change their minds sometimes about various minor details and what's a good argument and a bad argument. We do this all the time. He knows that we bicker a lot about this stuff. So we're always testing and correcting each other, as the Bible uses the phrase iron sharpens iron. But he claims here that we don't apply any skepticism to flat earth arguments, which is an absolute lie coming from someone who claims to be a subject matter expert. And then he says, to my questions of flat earthers, they often link to web pages that mock and mischaracterize the conventional, and I think correct, understanding of reality. Isn't he mocking right now? The whole book is a massive mockery. We've already seen examples of that. So take his own advice is what I would say. Look in the mirror when he says these things. And as I have in my notes here, we're just following his examples when we mock someone else's understanding of reality. We learned it from him. We're following his example. So if he doesn't like what we're doing, and we learned it from him, then we're not the ones who are having a problem here with things we shouldn't do, such as mockery and mischaracterization, which he's done in spades in this book. Then later he says, I haven't written this book for the benefit of these people, these true believers, because I don't think anything I could possibly say would change their minds. Good arguments would change our minds. Those have not been forthcoming. And then he says, to the contrary, one of the reasons I wrote this book is for people who have encountered flat earth arguments and are seeking help in deciding if those arguments are sound. If our arguments are so bad, why do they need help? So I say, actions versus words, Danny. You mock, smear, misrepresent, and demean, even calling some of us fake Christians. Back at you. No one can change your mind. But thus far, you've given nothing useful for your stated purpose here. Are you wanting to teach them how to troll? That's the example you're giving in this book, how to troll, not how to counter-argue. And then we see, he says, never mind the fact that almost no one for 2 millennia seemed to think so, which is again appeal to popularity or consensus about flat earth in general. So he says, when these writings recently began to circulate on the internet, some very conservative Christians who take a hyper-literal approach to Scripture encountered these arguments and accepted them. Very conservative Christian. What's hyper-literal? Isn't that the young earth creationist approach to Genesis? And this again is the wild inconsistency. In one context, Genesis 1, interweaved with statements about the earth's age are statements about its construction. How God made things are interweaved with statements about how long it took in the same context. So you can't take only some of the statements there as hyperliteral for young earth creationism and the other statements as allegorical or theological messaging or pre-scientific, because God couldn't get people to understand complex scientific things that actually you can trace back to the Babylonians. That's a good source, right? Young earth creationists. But the point is that he's calling the kettle black again, over and over. And he says, I wrote this book to counter the wrong approach to the Bible. Who is he to say that? Who is he to say what a wrong approach to the Bible is? He can have his opinion. He can say the approach I don't agree with. He can say, here's how you're misrepresenting the Bible, but so far he hasn't even cited the Bible. He hasn't gone to Genesis. He'll save that for way later. He says it's no coincidence that some Christians in the 19th century began believing the Bible teaches the earth was flat precisely when critics of the Bible started laying false accusations. Those misguided Christians unquestionably accepted that lie. We shouldn't believe the devil's lies. Wow. So those misguided Christians, whoever disagrees with Danny is falling for the devil's lies. That seems to be what he's saying. I'm telling you my opinion of what I think he's saying. So they're misguided if they're not being taught heliocentrism, which any atheist would happily learn. Why is he siding with atheists? He doesn't on an Earth's age. He'll stand right up against them. But not on Earth's shape, if you want to use that term. Because again, when we talk about an Earth-shaped debate, it's flat as the surface we live on, not the entirety of the Earth, because we know there's an underworld and there's waters above and waters below, and there's topography. But he's saying anybody who disagrees with his view is falling for the devil's lies, and that they're misguided. And then he says, finally, I've always suspected that there is a hidden agenda. Is that a conspiracy theory? Hidden agenda? Sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. Behind the recent revival of 19th century flat earth belief. We biblical creationists frequently are accused of believing everything in the Bible is literally true. Again, Genesis 1, remember? What is it that the old earth creationists and evolutionists say to you? That you believe everything the Bible says is literally true. And Michael Heiser rightly pointed out, even though he himself was an old earth, believed in evolution and theological messaging was a term that he coined, and did not believe the earth was flat or anything like that. He was a modern heliocentrist. And he pointed out how inconsistent this is, to believe earth is young but not flat. It's either all an allegory or theological messaging, or none of it is. And it's no more hyper-literal to take Earth's shape literally in the same context where they take it, the Bible statements about its age literally. Who is he to call flat earthers hyper-literal and think it's bad? That can splash right back in his face, and it should more often than it does. And he calls himself biblical creationist. I don't think that's an accurate term for what he's presenting here. He says, part of the motivation behind the modern flat earth movement is to undermine the credibility of the creation science movement. And here's his fear again. He's defining our motives again, but on the contrary, we're just being consistent. And it's scholars like him who undermine the Bible. You will not go against science, so-called. You will not go against modern heliocentrism, although you're perfectly willing to go against modern evolutionary theory. That's inconsistent and unbiblical. To be so inconsistent, that's bad hermeneutics. I think I can say objectively. Consistency with your whatever hermeneutic you choose, at least Heiser was consistent. Which of course painted him into a corner when it comes to miracles like the resurrection of Jesus. And I don't doubt his salvation. I've heard what he said on his deathbed, and it sounded very much like a saved person. But for some reason he believed that, even though it goes against science, but not the Bible's statements about creation. And he says, further telling us what his fears are and his motives, as one who has dedicated his life to sharing the reality of biblical creation with the world, I view the flat earth as a threat to my calling. Therefore, the third reason I wrote the book is to counter this attack. He is afraid. These are his own words. He's terrified because look at all the years he's spent and the polemics he's written on this topic, and he's still doing it, still sitting in a particular Discord server all the time, listening to flat earthers talk, which is, again, why he can't be accused of ignorance. He can only be accused of dishonesty. So he's divining our motives. We're being consistent. And we have the statement in black and white that he is afraid for his career, his reputation, and he believes he is under attack. This is not a good motivation to write anything, especially if you're a PhD. Now, thankfully, that's the end of chapter 1. But it doesn't get better, it gets worse. I'm sorry to say. But we'll forge ahead. I made myself pay for this, so we're going ahead. Yes, I did read the whole book, obviously. So getting past his opener, in chapter 2 is called Exhibit A, the Bedford Level Experiment and the Chicago Skyline. He says, more than anything else, it's probably Joshua Nowicki's famous photograph of the Chicago skyline from more than 50 miles away that convinced people in the 21st century to believe that the earth was flat. He made this up. He doesn't know this. He didn't ask anyone. And he blamed it on Eric Dubé in the first chapter. And maybe Samuel Rowbotham and people like that. And Eric Dubé is probably one of the most prominent in the modern times. I mean, Rowbotham isn't precisely modern, so he blames it on Eric Dubé, and now it's Joshua Nowicki of one photograph. And this is all we needed to show Earth is flat. This is not a problem for us, it's a problem for Danny and his fears. Now he has a little diagram of a circle with a triangle, one of whose vertices is in the center of the circle, one on one of the surface on one of the radii, and the other radii goes above the surface, and then you have a triangle that's from the center of the circle to the edge and a little above the edge, and just a little triangle there. And he says this is representing the radius of the Earth. Well, nobody has ever measured the radius. They calculate it from the circumference, which they also didn't measure. They calculated. They said Eratosthenes figured out the size, which he didn't. But anyway, he says from that height on his little diagram, where he says, let's see, I don't know where he says the height. He doesn't have any numbers on his diagram. But he says one can see the horizon at point B, a distance d away. Faulkner presumes that the observer looks down at the horizon, when in fact it's the observer who is the tangent point. If you're going to put somebody in a ball, if you stand on a ball, a really big one, you are the tangent point of any straight line going out from your feet. You are the tangent point. But that presumes you're on a ball in the first place, and the tangent is an imaginary line. But he instead, and everyone else I've seen trying to show Earth diameter and how far you should see over the curvature, will say that no, the tangent point is where you're looking, and you must be looking down, because on a ball, if you want to see the edge of the ball, and it's only balls that have edges, not flat planes, not the earth as the Bible defines it, you have to be looking down just a little. I've personally been told this by a math teacher, that I must be looking down just a little. This presumes you're on the ball and that the horizon is the earth curve, which it is not. We're going to talk about those optics again later, about why things disappear bottom first. I've already mentioned that a little bit. But you have to presume, as Faulkner is doing here, that the observer looks down at the horizon, and that's the tangent point. Why is that the tangent point? Where you're standing is the tangent. It's the observer who is the tangent point. So, and then he goes, this is probably why Rowbotham placed his telescope 8 inches above the water in the Bedford level experiment. Probably. And does his motivation matter? Was he trying to be sneaky? Is that what Faulkner is trying to imply here? The height is accounted for in any Earth curvature calculator. The observer's height in feet, or whatever you want to use. There are formulas for these things, and there are very precise Earth calculators, which all, by definition, have to ignore conditions such as these imaginary columns of ever-thickening air that bend things around the surface of a ball. So then he says, I guess by doubling the number of proofs, Dubé might think that his book is twice as good as some other guy's book. This is playground level mockery. Playground level. He's being snarky. You can almost see him wagging his head and sticking out his tongue as he says this. He should be ashamed of himself. This is just juvenile. There's just no other word for it. This is lower standards than I would expect for anybody with not even a high school education, let alone a PhD in anything. Then he says, under the explanation, take that as you will, first note that if the Earth is truly flat, then seeing very distant objects over such great distances ought to be a common occurrence on every clear day. Alas, it is not. Faulkner fails to explain why it should be common on a flat Earth. Are we ignoring conditions again? Optics doesn't matter right now? It's only invoked when it's convenient? That seems to be the pattern so far. He said, generally, this is because water, being a liquid, rapidly sinks to its own level, producing a surface of uniform height. Wow, what an insight from a PhD, that water, when it's not being agitated, has a flat surface. That's how you figure out how something's level. Sea level, mean sea level, means the average sea level between its lowest point, lowest tide, and high tide. And it's the same level all over the world. So you have this vertical maximum and minimum. You take the halfway point, and that's mean sea level. And it's the same mean sea level all over the world. You can't compare the height of Everest with Mount Rainier in the U.S. unless you're starting from the same plane. You cannot compare these levels on a ball unless you redefine level to mean equidistant from the surface of a ball, which is not what level means. When you level something, it's horizontal, and that word horizontal is derived from horizon, that flat thing you see when you look off in the distance, especially out on the water. So that's why you do these observations over water, not because you're trying to trick people with a temperature inversion, but because it's flat and unobstructed. But water, anyone knows, goes to its own level. It goes as low as possible, and then the surface of it, wherever it stops, is flat. So, super technical revelation that I'm sure nobody thought of before or nobody noticed. And he says that Rowbotham was a victim of a superior mirage. And this is the explanation of the other similar experiments in which objects beyond the horizon are visible. This is pure speculation, since Faulkner cannot know the conditions at the time. The observation has been repeated in modern times, and Faulkner cannot know each and every circumstance, nor does he even try to find out. And then he says, for one thing, superior mirages are mostly seen over water, while inferior mirages are mostly seen over land. And again, this is speculation and lack of precision. Mostly, usually, most commonly, cannot rule out exceptions, and those exceptions disprove or test the rule. The exception that tests the rule, people misunderstand that all the time. When you have a proving ground for, say, a car that you're developing, the proving ground is a testing ground. You take the car there to put it through its paces to see if it passes or fails. It is going to prove it. And that doesn't mean we've decided beforehand that it proves that the car is good. We're testing it to see if it is. So if you have exceptions, that's failures. Okay, that's how you have a falsifiable theory in science. You have to find a way that you would test it or prove it to see whether it can be falsified. And so if it can't be falsified, it is not a scientific theory. You can't falsify anything with words like usually and most commonly, because you have to deal with the exceptions. And then he says, let's see, I think we're on a different page now. When light travels from one medium to another, the path of the light is refracted or bent. I've already mentioned this and explained when that happens. But again, you must know that whatever you're looking at in the distance, even over water or land or whatever it is, you must know all the conditions between you and the object. And they can fluctuate while you're watching. So again, what has been proven about the shape of the Earth? Absolutely nothing. This important point about light traveling ultimately refutes the claim that light can bend thousands of miles around a giant ball. It's preposterous. And then he says, and we're skipping past a few pages here of totally irrelevant minutia, he says, therefore, inferior mirages usually appear inverted. That means upside down. So isn't he saying that all long-range images over land should be inverted? Why doesn't that happen? And then he goes on under superior mirages to say, with increasing distance from the object, the Earth's curvature causes the surface of the water to fall away from the beam of light. Begging the question, again, ignoring conditions, again, which he cannot know, again, and has not tried to determine. You would have to have some kind of sensor at each point between you and the object to know exactly how the light should refract. And you have to keep track of its changes from one minute to another. So then he says, light cannot do this, the things he's been talking about, so it continually is refracted downward, causing the light to bend around the edge of the Earth. What would make it, as I've said before, light doesn't move downward, it moves to the thickest point of a change in density. So Faulkner is presuming consistent temperature inversion over thousands of miles. They'd explained earlier that light must encounter a change in density to deviate, so to keep bending around the ball, it would have to encounter ever-increasing density changes for thousands of miles. I dare him to prove that it actually happens. I want him to measure it and observe it and prove it that way before claiming that this even happens or could happen. For a PhD in astronomy who should know something about optics to say it's refracted downward is just so sloppy. And then he says, what about tall objects, the tops of which may lie above the inversion layer? He says, being so tall, some rays of light from the top will be directed with a slight downward component. As those rays travel, they will enter the temperature inversion, which is permitted by Snell's law, but they will also be refracted downward towards the water, hence they can curve around the Earth's surface as well. What happens to the tall building since only some of its rays will be above the inversion layer? This is an ad hoc fallacy. He's making this stuff up. And then he says, variable refraction due to temperature inversions explains the other similar experiments, such as the Nowicki photograph. Since when is an observation an experiment? Variable refraction makes all this speculation utterly pointless. It's variable. Some will maybe bend it up, some down. How does this bend around a ball for thousands of miles? Especially after Danny just said how stable superior mirages are. And again, a photo is not an experiment. He says other photos show no buildings in Chicago, but he generally doesn't publish those because they aren't nearly as interesting. This is ad hominem against Nowicki. Again, Danny presumes to know the motives of other people. Like he was purposely trying to hide something. He doesn't know this guy. He didn't ask him. He just wants to assume he's an idiot because he took a photograph that shouldn't work on a ball, even with refraction. And then he says this variable visibility of Chicago, sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't. Gosh, do conditions change? This variable visibility is difficult for flat earthers to explain. How? And he says they don't even try, perhaps because they don't know about them. More condescension and motive divination. Perhaps. Maybe these flat earthers are just stupid or dishonest. Back at you, Danny. Then he says, there are people who think that the Earth's surface is the inside of a shell. This is irrelevant to the stated purpose of the book. Clearly, Faulkner is just smearing flat earthers. He thinks anyone who doesn't believe heliocentrism is an idiot or a liar. And again, look in the mirror when you say those things, because very few you're not a flat earther if you believe you're inside of a shell at all. Even a concave earther is not a flat earther. They too have to prove their curvature that they allegedly think is true. Why does he even bring this up? It's just juvenile smearing. I can't imagine another motive. And if he's gonna divine motives, then so can we. So let's leave the stupid shell comment and say, show on page 57, he says, however, what would happen if one were to repeat this experiment, he doesn't know what that is, over water that is warmer than the air temperature? He's setting up an experiment by controlling conditions and presuming results beforehand. Does nature have controlled conditions like that? Does he not know what begging the question is? And he says the water temperature was 62 to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, so the air immediately above the water was at least 10 degrees warmer than the air temperature of a short distance above the water. Is 10 degrees enough to have a significant impact on how far you can see? He doesn't really explain that. And whether, we would disagree on the definition of significant, I'm sure. But he says this is consistent with what we would expect on a spherical Earth, but not a flat Earth. Faulkner ignores everything he said earlier about optics and angles and conditions, because that would allow the observation on a flat Earth. Everything he's accusing flat earthers of doing is what he is demonstrating in his book. And then he says, with increasing distance, the turbulence will get worse and the images will get blurrier. Duh! So, there is no consistent, stable, horizontal bending of light, or even vertical, over increasing distances. It doesn't happen, according to him. And then again, he says, this is consistent with what we'd expect if the Earth is spherical, but it cannot be explained if the Earth is flat. Again, he's ignoring optical properties that he explained earlier, and the inconsistently he unwittingly invoked for turbulence. And then he says, some flat earthers have attempted to explain my results by claiming that the light from the ships has been refracted downward into the sea, merely giving the impression that the bottom of the ships are blocked by the Earth's curvature. Faulkner cherry-picked an uncommon flat Earth claim as normative. This is called an unrepresentative sample fallacy. And, excuse me, but boats sit in the water. They don't hover above them. And so, yeah, the bottom is hidden. And waves come up and go down. And if the curvature of the Earth is hiding the bottom of a boat, then how is it possible to bring it back with a telescope when it has disappeared to the naked eye? And you know those limits I talked about in an earlier video about vision in general, no matter how powerful of a scope you have, there's stuff between you and the thing you're looking at, stuff in the air, clouds, all sorts of conditions. Where is that, the bendy light property that you were trying to explain earlier? Because you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say it's Earth curvature and invoke optics at the same time. But he does. And then he says, but there was no temperature inversion that day of his observations as indicated by water and air temperature. Is he claiming to have measured air and water temperatures over the whole distance between him and the boat? Is that what he's claiming? And then he says it's ironic that flat earthers dismiss the effect of refraction in explaining their observations, but attempt to use the same effect to explain my observation. It's ironic indeed, since Danny does the same thing. And then he says, by doing so, they clearly indicate that they do not understand optics. More ad hom and a non sequitur and out lies. I think a lot of us do understand optics. Then he says those alleged proofs are flawed because they fail to take into account the atmospheric refraction due to temperature inversions. This is a baseless assertion, and he presumes knowledge of all conditions from observer to object again and again. Over and over he does this. Then he says the fact that inferior mirages consistently showed up in the photographs proves that there is no temperature inversion. The cause and effect claim is in affirming the consequent fallacy. And then he says, as I previously mentioned, flat earthers typically, all the smearing, dismiss this explanation, insisting that mirages are inverted. Many times they are. But what anybody typically does, he has not offered any data to back up this claim. So it's wrong. It's bad logic. It's bad science. It's bad observation. It's not considering all the variables. And he's just smearing people that he could ask directly, but doesn't. Because he's already decided that they're going to just hand wave dismiss everything he says, even though that's what he's doing to flat earthers. And he says, as I previously mentioned, flat earthers typically dismiss. I suspect that many flat earthers simply don't understand the difference between the two. And again, he's talking about inferior and superior mirages. I don't think a lot of astronomers understand it either. This is suspicion, presumption, ad hom throughout this whole paragraph, which was on page 63. And then on page 64, he says, I checked the water temperature, or it could be 63. Again, these page numbers are not all that precise. I checked the water temperature that day and the air temperature of the time of Dean Odel's experiment, which wasn't an experiment, and I found that conditions then were conducive for producing a temperature inversion. Conducive isn't measurement, and it still doesn't rule out a flat Earth. None of this rules out a flat Earth. He thinks it does, but he should know better. He knows the counter-arguments, but he has chosen not to respond to because he thinks they're stupid, and he's hand-wave dismissing and doing everything he thinks flat earthers do. So then he talks about ships on a dock and a crane in the distance, and he says, and I said, my note here is that he could have led with this about a ship between the dock and, different things at different distances, as everything to that point was irrelevant and unnecessary. Who wouldn't think that the ship would be between the observer and the cranes? You can read that part of the book and you see if you can make sense out of it. Nobody disagreed that the ship would be between the observer and the cranes. Why is this even being brought up? It just makes no sense. Anyway, we're going to finish up real soon here with this page. He says, this is exactly what we would expect to see if Earth is spherical. When viewed from enough distance, the hull of the ship will be obscured by the Earth's curvature, begging the question again. There are other causes for things to disappear bottom up. And then he says, lest anyone doubt my interpretation of this photograph, I discussed it with a retired Coast Guard Rear Admiral. Appeal to authority. He's a sailor, not a photo analyst. Not necessarily an expert in optics. Here he says he had conducted an experiment that disproved his belief that the Earth was flat. When did it disprove any such thing? Or more likely, Odell's, because the parishioner, someone in his church, probably consulted with Odell first. Again, with the you probably playground mentality. And I realize I'm going quickly here, but I just want to finish up. But magnification does not magically bring into view things that are otherwise obscured. That's true. Like the entire boat. Of course, the water the boat is floating in obscures the bottom, as I just said a little bit ago. So you try and make sense out of anything we're up to around the page 67 or so. So many fallacies, so much bad logic, so much ad hom. It's hard to keep up with. So we're going to stop here today. And if you can stay with it, I would appreciate if somebody does, because I had to buy the book and read it and then highlight it and make all these notes. So I'm sure something good will come out of it, although right now I can't imagine what, other than showing somebody's true colors. All right, so hopefully this has been of some value and interest, and thanks for watching.